Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. We are talking about Genesis chapter 45 today. Free PDF outline with all this information down in the description. It's on our website as with a lot of other free resources. My camera battery's dying, so I better be quick today. Genesis chapter 45. When did these events take place? We know that Joseph was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old. We know that he became the second most powerful man in Egypt when he was 30 years old. Now, we know from a statement that he makes in this chapter that this happened approximately 9 years later, which would place this in about 1706 BC. As far as our characters, of course, we have Joseph, who we've been talking about for quite a while and following his life story. He was the son of Jacob and Rachel, and as I mentioned, he's a ruler in Egypt at this point. We've also got his 11 brothers. They had come down to Egypt a couple times, and they had interacted with Joseph, but they didn't know who he was. And they had had some run-ins with him, and he was trying to test their character to see if they were different men than the men that they were when they sold him as a slave 20 plus years previously. And then we've got Pharaoh. He's, of course, the king of Egypt. And then Jacob. He was the grandson of Abraham and the father of Joseph and his 11 brothers. Now, for the all-important map, Joseph's brothers came from Canaan all the way down to Egypt to buy food during the famine. And in this chapter, Joseph is going to invite his family to move from Canaan down to Egypt, specifically to an area known as Goshen. As we go through our outline, let me remind you of what we talked about at the end of last chapter. You remember Joseph's silver cup had been found in Benjamin's sack. And at the end of 44, Judah stood before Joseph and he said, "Please let me take the place of Benjamin. Let me substitute myself. I will be your slave. Let Benjamin return home to my father, because it'll break his heart if he doesn't return." So now we are picking up with that conversation in our first section of 45, verses 1 through 8. Joseph is finally going to reveal his identity to his brothers. So after Joseph hears Judah's offer to substitute himself as a slave in Benjamin's place, he became emotional, and he sent all the Egyptians out of the room, and then he told his brothers who he was. He asked them about his father's health. Was Jacob still doing well? Was he still alive? But his brothers were too stunned to answer him one way or another. And Joseph told his brothers not to be distressed, not to be worried. He was not seeking revenge. In fact, he said that it was God who sent him to Egypt in order to save innumerable people from the famine that they were currently experiencing. Verses 9 through 15 is our next section. Joseph invites his family to come down and to live in Egypt. So there were still 5 years remaining in this 7-year famine. So Joseph said, "Look, don't starve up in Canaan. Come down here to Egypt and we will take care of you." So he invited his father, his brothers, and their families to come live in a place called Goshen. And then the Bible tells us that the brothers wept together and embraced, and they talked. I'm sure they had quite a bit to discuss and go over for the last 20 years of their history. In verses 16 through 20, we see that Joseph's hospitality is matched by Pharaoh's hospitality. So when Pharaoh's house heard that Joseph's brothers had arrived, Pharaoh was very pleased, and all the people in his house were very pleased. And Pharaoh offered to give wagons to the 11 brothers to help them to bring their families down to Egypt. He told them not to worry about their possessions, because when they arrived in Egypt, he would give them the best of the land. And then in our final section, verses 21 through 28, Joseph's brothers returned back to Canaan with gifts and good news for their father, Jacob. Joseph gave his brothers some gifts before they left. He gave each brother a pair of new clothes, but to Benjamin, he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothing. He sent 20 donkeys laden with gifts back to his father. And when Jacob's sons arrived back in Canaan, they went up to their father and they told him that Joseph was still alive and that he had become a ruler in Egypt. Now, Jacob didn't believe them initially, but as they talked with him more, told them about their experience with Joseph, and Jacob saw the wagons that had come from Pharaoh, the text says that, quote, "the spirit of their father Jacob revived." So Jacob agreed then to move his entire household down to Egypt because he wanted to see Joseph before he died. So that is Genesis chapter 45. Now let's talk about our application. God is always at work, even when it appears he might be absent. Looking back at his life, Joseph understood that God had used his brother's evil actions to bring about something good. We need to understand that just because something bad happens to our lives doesn't mean that God is no longer directing us or that he has abandoned us. Our current bad circumstances may only be the introduction to a story in which God works through us in powerful and great ways. And it's also very encouraging and relieving, at least to me, to know that God can take the sins that we've committed against people in our past and he can turn those things for good. It's not as if I sin against somebody or I do somebody wrong that messes up their story in the long run. Sure, maybe I should have been a better example. Maybe I should have been more Christ-like. But let's not be arrogant and think that we can ruin somebody else's life. Our ability to mess things up is a lot less than God's ability to patch them up and turn them for good.